1844. Deep in the rural swamps of Louisiana, in a forgotten French settlement called Belle-Mere, strange events began after the birth of a girl named Elise Morant. Silent during the day, timid, barely speaking a word. But after midnight, when the moon struck the cypress trees, her voice changed. She spoke in tongues no living soul had heard, languages extinct for centuries, dialects buried with ancient empires. Priests came to listen, scholars traveled from New Orleans. Doctors examined her voice, her sleep, her heartbeat, all left terrified, because the voices she spoke with weren't hers. And the dead wanted something back. Belle-Mere, Louisiana, in 1844 was not a place people stumbled upon by accident. It hid beneath trees thick as cathedral pillars, swallowed by curtains of Spanish moss that hung so low travelers often swatted them away, like ghosts brushing their faces. The air itself felt heavy, dragging through the lungs like warm syrup. The river whispered endlessly, carrying secrets from the swamps to the Gulf, and in that forgotten place, where the past refused to die, Elise Morant was born. Her mother, Julienne Morant, said the birth was silent, too silent. No cries, no scream, not even the sharp inhale babies instinctively make. When the midwife lifted the newborn, expecting squirming and shrill wails, Elise simply stared. Her eyes were wide, dark, and eerily focused, as if newborn vision could be perfect, as if she already recognized something in the room. "She's just tired," the midwife muttered, forcing a laugh. But even then the women felt a coldness in the cabin that had no business being there in the middle of a Louisiana summer. For the first 3 years of her life, Elise did not speak a single word. Not mama, not papa, not even baby noises or laughter. She pointed at what she wanted. She nodded. She cried only when hungry, but not one syllable escaped her lips. People in Belle-Mere whispered about her as if she were a cautionary myth. "The Morant girl's bewitched. She ain't right. She listens at night, I seen it, head tilted like someone calling her." It was true. Every night after sundown, Elise's behavior shifted. During the day she moved slowly, deliberately, almost as if the sunlight made her drowsy. But at night, especially after midnight, she sat upright in bed with eyes wide open, listening, always listening. Her mother often woke to find the child frozen in place, head slightly turned, eyes fixed on a corner of the room where nothing existed. "What do you hear, Sherry?" Julienne whispered once, touching her shoulder gently. Elise didn't respond. She didn't look away. Julienne followed the girl's gaze into the darkness of the corner. Something tightened inside her chest, a pressure she could never fully explain. The air felt heavier there, wrong, as if a presence lived in the shadows and only Elise could see it. By the time Elise turned 7, people in the settlement were openly uneasy around her. Children avoided her. Adults watched her with suspicion. And her father, Mathieu Morant, a man who prided himself on reason, rarely looked her in the eye anymore. It wasn't the silence that unsettled him, it was her eyes. She always looked as if she knew something he didn't, something no child should know. The night of first voice. The first voice came on a stormy summer night. Thunder rolled across Belle-Mere like a giant's footsteps. Rain hammered the roof, leaking through thin cracks in the old wooden boards. Lightning flashed again and again, illuminating the room where Elise slept. At the stroke of 12:01 a.m., she sat up straight. Not slowly, not groggily, but like a puppet pulled upright by invisible strings. Julienne, asleep in the next room, stirred at the sound. Something like a soft hum, low and steady. It wasn't the wind, wasn't the rain, wasn't the house settling. It was a voice, a young voice, a feminine voice. It took her a moment to realize it was Elise. Julienne rushed in, expecting to see her daughter whispering or muttering, but what she witnessed froze her to the doorway. Elise's eyes were closed, her body was rigid, and the voice coming from her mouth did not belong to a child. It was older, deeper, and speaking words Julienne had never heard in her life. "Asur Sasaru," the voice uttered. The accent was ancient, heavy. The syllables rolled like they were carved in stone. "Elise," Julienne breathed. The girl did not move. "Elise?" She rushed forward and shook her daughter's shoulder. The girl's eyes snapped open, but the voice continued speaking without pause, without breath, without breaking rhythm. Julienne's hands trembled. Her breath came fast and shallow. She backed away and whispered a prayer. She had no idea what language her daughter spoke. But she knew two terrifying things. That language was not of their time, and that voice was not her daughter's. The days that followed, the next morning Elise behaved as if nothing had happened, ate breakfast, watered the chickens, stared at sunlight the way she always did, half irritated, half exhausted. Her mother watched her from across the table, hands gripping her fork so hard her knuckles whitened. "Do you remember last night?" she asked. Elise blinked slowly, then shook her head. "You didn't hear anything?" Another silent shake. Julianne said nothing more. Part of her wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, but that illusion shattered the following night. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the voice returned. A different language, sharper consonants, rhythmic, almost like chanting. Mathieu heard it this time. He stormed into the room, lantern trembling in his hand as he stared at his rigid daughter speaking flawlessly in a tongue that seemed to predate the house they stood in. "What devilry," he whispered. Julianne slapped his arm. "Don't you say that about her. Don't you ever." But even she looked terrified. The next morning at the general store, people noticed the Morants' pale faces and trembling hands. Word spread fast. Louisiana settlements thrived on gossip as much as they feared it. "That child ain't right," someone muttered. "I heard she speaks dead speech. Bring a priest, bring a doctor, or bring a Bible." Elise heard none of it. During daylight she moved like a ghost, quiet, distant, and empty. But at night something else controlled her tongue. Something ancient, something restless, something that had been waiting for her. The twitching of the walls. One night Julianne woke to a new sound, the sound of the wooden walls themselves vibrating. At first she thought it was thunder, then she realized it synchronized with Elise's speech. Every syllable pulsed through the wood, every phrase made dust fall from the rafters, every breathless chant made the lantern flame flicker wildly. The house trembled with her. Julianne covered her ears. Mathieu ran outside with terror in his eyes. Neighbors awoke and stepped onto their porches, staring at the Morant home as low rumbles echoed from inside. Elise was speaking faster, her voice layered, like overlapping whispers, like multiple mouths speaking through her at once. And then, everything stopped. The trembling, the voices. Even the storm clouds in the distance seemed frozen in place. At exactly 12:44 a.m., Elise opened her eyes. And this time she whispered something soft, in a language that needed no translation. "They're coming." Julianne staggered, backward, tears streaming down her face. "Who, baby? Who's coming?" But Elise only tilted her head, listening to something only she could hear. For weeks, whispers ran through Belmire like wind through the sugarcane fields. People avoided the Morant family, stepping off the road whenever they approached, lowering their heads as though the girl carried a plague. Even the bravest men refused to cut through the woods behind their cabin, claiming they heard faint murmurs in the trees after midnight. And yet, none of them had heard what Elise truly spoke. None of them had stood inside that room when her voice split the silence like ancient thunder. None of them had seen her small frame shudder as languages older than Louisiana itself poured from her throat. Only her parents and the desperate few they summoned witnessed it, and the truth frightened them more than the swamp ever could. The priest arrives. Father Jean Leclerc, a visiting Jesuit priest from New Orleans, was the first outsider to hear Elise speak. He was a tall, narrow man with bony hands and deep-set eyes that held too many secrets. When word reached him that a child in Belmire spoke in unknown tongues at night, he traveled the half-rotted roads to the little settlement. When he entered the Morant cabin, the air changed. The priest paused at the doorway and whispered, "Something old lives here." Julianne flinched. Mathieu looked away. Inside the girl's room, Elise sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at the windowsill, not blinking, not moving, waiting, as though she knew exactly why the man had come. The priest sat gently before her. "My child," he whispered, "do you know who I am?" Elise did not answer. She lifted her hand slowly and pointed toward the floorboards beside him. The priest followed her finger. The wood under his boots vibrated. Midnight comes. Father Leclerc insisted on staying until the hour of her change, as Julianne called it. The lanterns were dimmed. The windows were latched. The family sat around the bed as though attending a vigil. At 11:59 p.m., Elise closed her eyes. At 12 a.m., silence swallowed the room. At 12:01, the first voice came. A deep, ancient growl rolled out of the girl's small body. The priest froze, his eyes widened. "That cadence," he whispered. "It cannot be," Elise continued. "Summa sumsu anadini itadi." Father Leclerc sprang to his feet. "That is Old Akkadian," he breathed, "a language dead for nearly 3,000 years. But Elise was not finished. At 12:06, her voice shifted into a different rhythm, faster, sharper, clipped. "Cantharos epistemai, eke phos aphthanos." The priest staggered backward, crossing himself in panic. "That's classical Greek, older than the Gospel." But Elise's voice was already changing. At 12:14, she switched to a harsh, rattling tongue, each syllable cracking like bone. "Swenther alth mork." "Gothic," Father Leclerc whispered. "No one on earth speaks Gothic anymore." Mathieu grabbed the priest's sleeve. "What does she say? Do you know?" The priest shook his head. "It is fragments, warnings, invocations. She's not merely imitating, she understands them." Julianne sobbed quietly behind him. The record of languages. The priest began writing frantically, filling pages of his journal. Language 1, Old Akkadian, the tongue of ancient Babylon. Language 2, Classical Greek, older than the Apostles. Language 3, Gothic, dead for more than 1,000 years. But there were more, much more. At 12:21, Elise spoke a flowing, melodic language with rolling R's and long vowels. "Ita moira swillen fin." "Celtic," the priest whispered, one of the ancient forms, nearly forgotten. At 12:28, her voice became sharp and zigzagged, like words designed for mountains. "Gur isiltsen dira." "Basque," he murmured, shocked. But Old Basque, older than anything recorded. At 12:31, she switched to a guttural, rhythmic chant that made the very walls tremble. "Tulenkrath Norder." "Old Norse," he gasped. "Not modern. This is Viking era." The priest's hands trembled so violently the ink smeared across his journal. Julianne watched in horror as Elise's head tilted, her eyes rolling back. "Make her stop," she cried. "Please, make her stop." But Father Leclerc couldn't. He didn't dare touch her. The final voice began at 12:39. This language was unlike the others. It was older, darker, stranger. The words came slow, each syllable dragging out like a funeral bell. "Heilon Marteka." "Shuneva." The priest leaned in, struggling to identify it. After a moment he whispered, "I do not know this tongue." Mathieu swallowed hard. "Is it human?" For the first time that night. Father Leclerc said nothing. His silence was answer enough. The last utterance. As the final language echoed through the room, every candle flickered. The shadows stretched unnaturally long. The floorboards moaned under an unseen weight. Elise's voice deepened until it no longer sounded like a child's voice at all. Then she whispered a phrase that shook the priest to his knees. "Open the gate. They have waited long enough." Every lantern in the room extinguished at once. Darkness swallowed them. Julianne screamed. Mathieu reached blindly for his daughter. The priest fell back against the wall, clutching his cross tightly. And then, silence. Elise slumped forward unconscious, her breathing slow, almost peaceful, as if possessed by nothing more than sleep. After midnight, when dawn arrived, the priest had not slept. He sat on the porch, trembling, staring at the swamp as a light mist rolled over the water. His journal sat open in his lap, filled with frantic scribbles. Mathieu approached him quietly. "Father, what did all that mean?" The priest didn't look up. "It means," he whispered, "that your daughter is not speaking to the dead." Mathieu frowned. "Then who?" Father Leclerc slowly closed the journal. "She is speaking for them." The morning after Father Leclerc witnessed Elise's 7 dead languages, the Morant cabin felt wrong, not cursed, not haunted. Something worse, watched. It was the kind of oppressive stillness that made the birds avoid the trees, the wind avoid the windows, and even the insects keep their distance as though they sensed something ancient had awakened beneath the wooden planks. Julianne was the first to notice it. While sweeping the floor, she paused. The bristles dragged strangely, not smoothly, not lightly, like the floorboards were breathing beneath her feet. The quiet that wasn't. Mathieu sat sharpening his hunting knife on the porch when he felt the vibration again, the same one the priest felt the night before, A low hum, a tremor too steady, too rhythmic to be settling wood. Inside, Elise sat with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the knots in the floor. Her small finger traced the wood grain almost lovingly. Julianne approached carefully. "Sweetheart, are you feeling all right?" Elise didn't look up. "Shh," she whispered. "They're listening." Julianne's throat tightened. "Who's listening, mon cœur?" She pointed at the floorboards. "Everyone." The scratching begins. That night, just after supper, they heard it. A faint scratch. Not inside the walls. Not outside the cabin. Underneath. Mathieu dropped his spoon. Julianne froze mid-breath. The sound came again. Skr, 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 tap, like fingernails dragging slowly along the underside of the planks. Julianne whispered, "Tell me that's a possum." Mathieu didn't answer. Even the swamp outside seemed to hold its breath. Then a final scrape, long and deliberate, ran from one end of the cabin to the other, right under Elise's bare feet. But the girl didn't flinch. She only smiled faintly. "They found where the gate is," she said softly. "They're trying to open it." Mathieu bolted upright. "What gate? There is no gate under this house." Elise's head tilted. "Yes, Papa, there is. You just never knew where to look." Father Leclerc returns. By morning, the Marants were waiting outside for the priest to return. When he finally arrived, his face looked hollow, eyes sunken from a sleepless night. Julianne rushed toward him, grabbing his arm. "Father, there's something under our home. Please, you have to bless it." The priest nodded slowly. "I feared this." He stepped inside the cabin and knelt on the floor, his fingers spread across the boards, feeling the faint rhythmic pulse beneath them. "I prayed for guidance," he murmured, "and the answer I received was troubling." "What answer?" Mathieu asked. Father Leclerc hesitated, then he whispered, "The languages your daughter speaks. They come from civilizations that believed the earth was divided by veins, pathways the dead could walk." Mathieu's voice cracked. "And you think one is under my house?" "I don't think," the priest said. "I know. The lost map of the Marais." The priest pulled a folded sheet from his satchel, an old French map of the Louisiana territory. Thin, curled edges, almost fossil-like. He spread it across the table. The drawing showed the swamp as it had been surveyed in the early 1700s. Wild, unknown, marked only by rough paths carved by explorers. Father Leclerc tapped a symbol near the center, a black circle. This was called Le Node. The knot. Mathieu frowned. "So what is it?" "A convergence point," the priest whispered, "where old spirits gathered. A place the natives avoided, the French feared, and the Spanish refused to record." Mathieu felt the room tilt. "And our cabin is built on it." The priest didn't answer. He didn't have to. The night of the first knock. That evening, an unnatural stillness settled over Belmire. Even the frogs, usually deafening after sunset, were silent. Julianne paced beside Elise's bed while Mathieu stood guard with his rifle. Father Leclerc remained by the table, praying under his breath. At 11:52 p.m., the scratching began again. Skirting began again. Elise opened her eyes. Julianne grabbed her daughter safe. "We're all here." Elise looked at her mother with pity. "No, Mama," she said gently. "You're not." At 11:59, the floor shook. At 12, the first knock came. Knock, so loud the lanterns flickered. Julianne screamed. Mathieu raised his rifle. "Stay behind me." But the knocking didn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. It moved, traveling beneath the floor, circling the cabin. Father Leclerc shouted a prayer, voice trembling. "Spirits of the unclean, leave this place. You are not welcome." The knocking paused. Then, a new sound. Soft, wet, like something dragging flesh against the wood. Mathieu whispered, "My God." Julianne collapsed to her knees. "What do they want from us?" Elise spoke quietly. "They want what they lost." The gate opens. At 12:07, the boards under Elise's bed cracked, not from weight, from pressure rising upward. Something pushing through. The priest rushed toward the bed. "Mathieu, help me move her." But Elise didn't move. She stood by herself, stepping gracefully off the mattress like she was being lifted by unseen hands. Her eyes rolled back. Her mouth opened, and the seventh voice, the one the priest couldn't identify, returned. "Hailon, Marteka, Va." The floor split. A thin black seam ran across the cabin, glowing faintly like embers smoldering beneath the boards. Mathieu backed away in horror. What is that?" Father Leclerc whispered. "The gate." The crack grew wider. A cold wind blew upward, impossible, unnatural, carrying with it the stench of wet earth and old bones. Lanterns extinguished, shadows stretched like fingers across the room. Julianne sobbed, pulling Mathieu's arm. Do something. Do something." But no one could. Elise hovered inches above the ground now. Her voice deepened. Her hair lifted. The cabin trembled, and from the widening crack beneath her, a hand reached out, thin, grey, with nails like stone, scraping against the boards as it pulled itself upward. Julianne screamed so loudly her voice broke. Mathieu fired his rifle, but the bullet vanished into the darkness below as though swallowed. Father Leclerc stumbled back, crucifix shaking in his hands. And Elise, still suspended in air, whispered the final phrase, "They're coming through." The floor split open. The room filled with cold black air, and something older than language crawled toward the light. The night after the gate first cracked open under the Morant cabin, every soul in Belle Mere felt the disturbance, even those who never met the girl who spoke in dead tongues. Animals paced their pens in terror. Dogs howled until their throats bled, and the old swamp cypress trees groaned like they were being bent by invisible hands. Inside the Morant cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating. Father Leclerc had sealed the crack in the floor with salt and prayer, but everyone sensed the truth. It was only temporary. Elise slept with unnatural stillness, hands folded on her chest, eyes closed but moving rapidly beneath the lids, like someone dreaming with a mind that wasn't theirs. Julianne sat beside her daughter's bed, gripping a rosary until her knuckles turned white. Mathieu didn't sleep at all. He sat in the rocking chair facing the window, rifle across his lap, and it was while he watched that window that he saw the first one, the first face. It appeared at 12:03 a.m., just after midnight. A silhouette, tall, thin, unmoving, its head tilted in a way no humans could. At first, Mathieu thought it might be a lost traveler, someone foolish enough to wander the swamp at night. But as the figure pressed closer to the glass, pale moonlight revealed its skin, ash-gray, pitted like old stone, and stretched thin enough to show the skull beneath. Mathieu froze. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. The figure raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and placed its fingers against the window. Tap, tap, tap. Knocking with a rhythm that matched the one beneath the floor the previous night. Mathieu's voice cracked. "Julianne, wake the priest." But before his wife could move, Elise sat upright with a gasp, as if pulled by a string. "They found me," she whispered. "The second and third." The lantern flickered violently as another figure stepped from the shadows outside. Then another. 3 silhouettes now stood at the window, all silent, all staring at Elise. Their faces were different, one with hollow cheeks and long hair, one with a jagged mouth, one with sunken sockets where eyes used to be. But their bodies moved the same way, stiffly, wrongly, like marionettes tugged by invisible wires. The priest burst from the corner, clutching his crucifix, in the name of the Father. But Elise turned her head sharply toward him, and her voice, low, foreign, ancient, cut through his prayer. "They do not fear your symbols." Her words weren't defiant. They were sad, resigned. Julianne grabbed her daughter's arm. "Honey, don't talk like that. Don't look at them." Elise looked at her mother with a softness that scared more than anger would have. "I knew they would come for me. They always do." Her mother shivered. "Who are they?" Elise's eyes drifted back to the window where the silhouettes waited patiently. "They are the ones who lost their voices. And now they want mine." The tapping begins. All at once the 3 figures began tapping on the glass. Tap, 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 tap. In perfect unison. Mathieu raised his rifle. "Stay back." But the girl shook her head. "You can't kill them." The priest's voice trembled. "Why are they here? What do they want from you?" Elise whispered. "They want the gate opened, and they want me to finish the chant." Julianne pulled her closer. "Then we'll leave. We'll run tonight." Elise's expression darkened. "We can't leave, Mama." "Why not?" "Because they're behind the house, too." Mathieu's stomach dropped. He stood and peeked out the back window. His breath caught in his throat. There were 6 more silhouettes standing behind the cabin, silent, still, waiting. All facing the house, all facing Elise. The swamp goes quiet. Father Leclerc stumbled toward the door. "We must contact the bishop. This is no longer an affliction, this is an incursion." But as he reached for the handle, something slid across the door from the outside. A palm, gray, thin, leaving streaks of swamp mud as it dragged downward. Then a second hand, then a third. Soon the entire door frame was covered in hands pressing inward, fingers curling along the edges, testing the wood like a creature testing a cage. Julianne screamed. Mathieu pulled her and Elise back. The priest dropped to his knees and began praying loudly, trembling. "Deliver us from the realm of the dead. Deliver us from the unclean. Deliver us." The lanterns flickered, the air chilled, and then a voice spoke outside the window, not Elise's voice, not human, a rasp like wind through old tombstones. Elise, Elise, dragging her name through syllables that didn't belong in the living world. Julianne covered her ears, sobbing, "Make them stop. Mathieu, please, make them stop." But Mathieu was frozen in terror. And Elise, she simply stared at the window and whispered back, "I hear you, but I won't follow." The shattering. The silhouettes stopped tapping. Everything went still. Then, crack. A long fracture appeared in the window glass, starting in the center and spreading outward like a spiderweb. Another crack, and another. The priest shouted, "Get away from the windows." Mathieu pulled Elise and Julianne toward the hallway just as, shatter. The window exploded inward. Glass rained across the room. Cold, swamp-scented air blasted inside, and the silhouettes stepped through the shattered window frame, no longer shadows, no longer distant shapes, but physical, real, and horribly visible. Their bodies were thin and gray, stretched like leather left in the sun for centuries, their joints bent wrong. Their faces were sunken and lipless, their teeth exposed in permanent death grins, but the worst were their eyes, not empty, not hollow, glowing faintly, like embers left after a dying fire. Julianne screamed. Father Leclerc fainted. Mathieu fired his rifle into the chest of the nearest figure. The bullet passed straight through it, thudding uselessly into the wooden wall. The creature didn't even flinch. It simply raised a finger toward Elise, and the girl whispered, "They're not here to kill us." Julianne grabbed her. "Then what do they want, baby?" Elise stepped backward as the creatures advanced. Her voice softened. "They want to bring me with them." The chant returns. As the creatures reached for her, Elise's body convulsed. Her back arched sharply, her limbs stiffened, her mouth opened against her will, and the 7th oldest language poured out, deep, slow, monumental, a language like grinding stone and breaking earth. The cabin shook, the floor cracked, the swamp outside howled like 1,000 dead voices roaring at once. The creatures responded, lifting their heads as though receiving orders. Their arms extended, their mouths opened, and they whispered back in the same ancient tongue, together, calling, summoning, finishing the ritual. Julianne lunged forward, trying to grab Elise. Mathieu grabbed her waist, pulling her back. "No, don't touch her." The priest regained consciousness just long enough to see the scene. His eyes went wide with horror. "Dear God, she's the conduit." The ground shook violently. The walls bent inward, and the glowing crack beneath the cabin burst open again, wider, brighter, filled with swirling black mist and the sound of thousands of voices rising. Julianne screamed her daughter's name, and Elise, shaking, crying, unable to control her own body, looked at her mother with tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Mama." Her feet lifted from the ground. The creatures reached upward. The gate roared, and the chapter ended, with Elise rising slowly toward the ceiling as the dead reached up to claim her. The night the silhouettes shattered the window, and Elise rose screaming toward the ceiling. Something inside Father Leclerc finally broke. Not his faith, not his courage, his understanding of what faith and courage truly required, because the moment he saw those gray, death-hollow figures speaking in the same ancient tongue as the girl, the priest realized something awful. This was not the first time the dead had used a child as their doorway, and worse, the church had known. The morning after the attack, the Morant cabin looked like it had survived a hurricane. Shattered window glass glittered across the floor like frost. The boards were cracked open again, glowing faintly where the gate pulsed beneath them. Salt circles had been scattered by the creature's movement, trampled and useless. Julianne was on her knees, holding Elise against her chest like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. Mathieu stood guard at the shattered window, rifle in one hand, lantern in the other, looking like he hadn't blinked in an hour. Father Leclerc knelt in the corner, bruised and shaken, staring at the floor with a 1,000-yard stare. When Elise finally fell unconscious, after the creatures vanished with the fading glow of the gate, Father Leclerc whispered, "I have to go." Julianne whipped around. "What do you mean, go? You're the only one who knows what this is." The priest looked sicker than ever. "That is precisely why I must leave. The answers are not here." He touched the old crucifix hanging from his neck. "They are where this began." Mathieu's voice cracked. "You said this has happened before. You said you recognized the signs." Leclerc hesitated. Then he nodded. "The church kept records, not public ones, not in any parish library. These are centuries old, locked away in French archives where the Vatican first heard rumors of the gatewalkers." Julianne stared at him. "What are gatewalkers?" Leclerc swallowed. "The ones who speak the dead languages, the ones the spirits try to use." His voice dropped to a whisper. "The ones who do not survive." Julianne clutched Elise tighter. "No, no, she is not dying." "Over my dead body." Leclerc stood shakily. "She will die, Julianne, unless I find out what happened to the others. The record of 1520. Father Leclerc saddled his mule before dawn. The swamp fog curled around him like pale ribbons, and the trees loomed overhead, silent and watchful. He rode to the small parish church of Belle-Mere, an old French structure with peeling paint and a door that groaned like an injured man whenever it opened. Inside, he lit a single candle and walked to the back room where the old locked trunks were stored. He had kept these records hidden for years. Even the bishop believed they were folklore. But Leclerc knew better now. His hands shook as he unlocked the first trunk. He removed a leather-bound ledger, written in French, dated 1520. The entry was short. "The girl of Narbonne speaks the lost tongues after the 7th moon. Her voice opens the earth. Her body cannot contain them. When the gate widened, she led the village into the marsh. None returned." Another entry below it. "Burn the house where she lived. Salt the ground. Do not let another child be born on the knot." Then, in smaller handwriting, added years later, "One village obeyed, another did not." Father Leclerc's chest tightened. "Belle-Mere," he whispered. The second trunk held the next record, dated 1643, written during the French expansion into the marshlands. More of the same, a child. A language no one recognized. Nightly visitors at the windows, a gate in the earth. A note scrawled in the margin. "We could not stop the opening once the child began the 7th tongue." Another scribble. "If such a child is born again, flee." Leclerc's heart pounded, because the final line written in trembling ink was this: "The dead do not want the world. They want a voice, a mouth, a body, a horrible connection." The priest slammed the ledger shut. He wiped sweat from his forehead, trembling. He understood now. The languages Elise spoke weren't random. They weren't curses. They weren't possessions. They were keys. Each dead language unlocked a part of the gate beneath the earth. Each word widened the tear between the living and the dead. And Elise, born on the knot, just like the girl of 1520, was the perfect vessel. Because she wasn't chosen, she was inherited. The Morants had unknowingly built their home on the ancient opening point. The spirits had been waiting, for decades, perhaps centuries. And now the door was almost open. Leclerc grabbed the ledger and ran outside. He mounted the mule so fast the animal protested. He needed to reach the Morant cabin. He needed to warn them. He needed to... The figure on the road. Halfway back to Belle-Mere, fog thickened around him, muffling the world into silence. Then he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the swamp road. At first he thought it was a man. But it was too tall, too thin, too still. The same grey, death-stretched skin, the same hollow eyes, one of the visitors, blocking his path. The mule refused to move. It trembled beneath him like it might collapse. Father Leclerc whispered a prayer under his breath. The figure slowly raised its arm, its finger pointed. Not at Leclerc, behind him. The priest slowly turned, and his blood ran cold, because another figure stood in the fog at his back, then a third, then a fourth, encircling him, just like they had encircled the Morant cabin. The priest clutched his crucifix, in the name of the Father. But a voice cut him off, not human, not alive. Leclerc, the creature in front of him, spoke his name. The girl will finish what the others began. The creature's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and you know too much. Before Leclerc could spur his mule, a dozen gray hands reached out from the fog, clawing, grabbing, dragging him off the saddle. The priest screamed, a bone-deep wail that echoed across the swamp. The ledger fell to the mud, pages fluttered in the wind, the candle wax seal melted in the fog, and Father Leclerc's scream was cut short, as the dead pulled him silently into the darkness, back at the Morant cabin. At that exact moment, miles away, Elise jolted awake with a choke. Julianne grabbed her. "Honey, baby, what's wrong?" Elise's voice was small, but it broke the room like glass. "Someone just died in the swamp." Matthew froze. Julianne's breath hitched. "Who?" And Elise whispered, "The one who tried to save me." Eliza Thorne did not walk back to the manor that night. She drifted. Her feet touched the dirt road, but she felt none of it. The faint glow of moonlight slid across her hair, but she didn't feel that either. Everything was distant, muffled, as though the world were wrapped in cotton. The voices, however, the voices were sharp. They clung to her like smoke. Some were high-pitched, some low, some breathless, as if spoken from dying lungs. But all of them spoke in the same rhythmic pattern, the same ancient cadence, like a forgotten prayer trying to pull itself back into existence. And Eliza could understand every word, every single one. She didn't tell anyone that. Not Aunt Marie, who had fainted the moment she was brought home. Not the doctor who dabbed her forehead with shaking hands. Not the priest who muttered prayers more for his own safety than hers. Because deep down, Eliza understood one awful truth. The voices weren't done with her, and speaking about them might make them louder. The morning after midnight, Eliza was expected to rest, but every time she closed her eyes she saw the swamp. Not the swamp as people knew it, not the shallow waters, not the cattails, not the croaking frogs. She saw the black place behind the trees, where sound didn't travel, where something waited, something old. The first morning after the ritual, she sat upright in bed before the sun rose. Sweat drenched her nightgown. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. The voices whispered, "Open the door, child. Dawn is no barrier to the dead." She covered her ears. It didn't help. When the sunlight finally filled her room, the whispers quieted. They didn't vanish, they never vanished, but they sank into the background like insects humming far inside the walls. Aunt Marie entered with breakfast, cornbread, eggs, milk. Eliza could smell everything too vividly, as if her senses had been sharpened to a painful degree. The milk soured her stomach. The cornbread smelled like dust. The eggs tasted metallic. But she ate anyway. She had to pretend. Aunt Marie watched her carefully. Eyes full of terror she tried desperately to hide. "Eliza," she whispered, "do you remember anything from last night?" Eliza lifted her eyes slowly. Aunt Marie recoiled, because Eliza's eyes didn't look like they used to. They were still her same hazel color, but there was depth behind them now. Layers. Like someone else was standing behind her pupils and peering out. "I don't remember," Eliza lied. Her voice sounded normal to her, yet Aunt Marie flinched. The voices chuckled. "She knows you lie. They always do, training the impossible." The priest insisted Eliza should rest in church until she was stable, but stability was something impossible now. Her mind had become a crowded hallway filled with strangers speaking in different tongues. Latin, Greek, Sumerian, Babylonian, Hittite, languages no child should know, languages no one alive remembered accurately. Yet Eliza understood them all, and when she spoke, even softly, even accidentally, the words wrapped themselves around her tongue like familiar serpents. Father Abrams tried to test her. He pointed to scripture in languages he didn't expect her to identify. Eliza read every line perfectly, even the annotations written centuries before the Bible's printing, even the scribbles in the margins left by monks on cold nights. even the mistranslations. She corrected him, and that terrified him. "She's possessed," he whispered to Aunt Marie outside the church, thinking Eliza couldn't hear, but her hearing had changed too. She heard everything, everything. She heard the shift of rats between wooden boards. She heard a woman 3 miles away scream at her husband. She heard the priest's heartbeat fast and uneven. She heard Aunt Marie whisper, sobbing, "I just want my baby back." Eliza clenched her fists. The voices wanted to respond for her. They wanted to speak through her mouth in the 7 dead languages. Eliza held them back. But it was getting harder. The first sign, it began subtly. Objects around her vibrated, not violently, just enough that the edges blurred. Books shook when she walked past. Windows crackled. Candles flickered even without wind. Then came the real sign. 3 days after the ritual, as Eliza sat alone in her room, a small wooden box on her dresser began to rattle. It was the jewelry box her mother once owned, a thing so old its hinges were rusted shut. Eliza stared at it. The voices whispered, "Call to it." "No," Eliza murmured. "Stop. Call to IT." The voice this time was deeper. Male. Ancient. She felt the presence behind it, a shadow that had followed her from the swamp. Something powerful, patient, waiting. Her heartbeat hammered. The jewelry box flew open, not gently, not slowly. It snapped open with a force that cracked the hinge. A thin chain necklace lifted out of the box, hanging in midair like a puppet on an invisible string. It hovered in front of Eliza, then wrapped around her wrist. She screamed. Aunt Marie burst into the room. The necklace immediately fell to the floor. "Eliza, what's wrong?" Eliza couldn't breathe, because the voices now whispered in perfect English. "You brought us back. Now we bring you forward." Forward into what? They would not say. The police arrive. Rumors spread faster than rabies in Louisiana summer. A child who spoke ancient languages. A girl who survived the swamp after midnight. A ritual people swore was witchcraft. A priest who suddenly refused to enter his own church. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies. They questioned Eliza gently at first. But when they asked whether anyone else had been with her during the ritual, her voice slipped, just for a moment, into one of the dead languages. The sheriff dropped his pen. One deputy clutched his cross. The other backed away like she had grown fangs. Eliza tried to explain. She tried to speak normally. But the voices used her throat without her permission. Words spilled out of her in the language of the dead, the 7th tongue, the forbidden one, the one that had not been spoken aloud for thousands of years. Aunt Marie fell to her knees. The sheriff ran. The deputies crossed themselves in terror, and the entire parish knew Eliza Thorne was no longer just a survivor. She was an omen. Signs in the swamp. Night came. Eliza could no longer sleep. Every time she drifted off, she found herself dreaming from the perspective of something else. Something moving through the swamp on long limbs, almost spider-like. She could taste mud in her dreams. She could feel the cold water crawling over her skin. She could hear chanting in the distance, not from people, but from the swamp itself. It was calling to her, and she knew she would eventually have to answer. By the 7th night, the hallucinations began, faces in mirrors, shadows that didn't belong to anyone in the room, figures standing at the end of her bed, whispering in dead languages she herself had revived. And then came the symbol, carved into her window pane one morning, a circle intersected by 7 lines, a language older than Mesopotamia. Aunt Marie fainted again. The priest refused to step foot on the property. The sheriff ordered the family to keep the child indoors until we understand what we're dealing with. But nobody could confine Eliza. Not anymore, because the voices, the dead languages, were not just speaking to her now. They were speaking through her, even when she stayed silent. People across the parish began dreaming in languages they shouldn't know. Children woke screaming at night, shouting words with no translation. Dogs howled at the same hour every evening. Something was happening, something spreading, and Eliza was the center of it. The change. On the 10th night after the ritual, Eliza felt something shift inside her. Not a voice, not a whisper. A door she had not known existed. A door that the 7 languages had been circling around like vultures around a corpse. When it opened, even slightly, every candle in the house went out. The windows shattered, and Eliza heard a voice unlike the others, calm, heavy, shaped like thunder. "You are almost ready." "Ready for what?" The answer came in the seventh language, spoken gently, lovingly, horribly. "To finish what your mother began." Eliza froze. The room seemed to tilt. Her mother? The quiet, soft-spoken woman who died when Eliza was only 4. What did she have to do with this? More whispers came, layer upon layer, some sorrowful, some joyful, some ecstatic with madness. "Your blood remembers. It waited for you. You are the last tongue, the gate, the key." Eliza fell to her knees, because now she understood. The ritual had not awakened the 7 dead languages. It had awakened the thing that created them, and that thing was coming for her. The night the storm returned to Belmere, the entire settlement seemed to hold its breath. The swamp smelled different, like wet stone, river mud, and something else beneath it, something metallic and sharp. The wind carried faint murmurs that sounded like voices, but not in any language the townsfolk recognized. Some people locked their doors, others prayed. A few stood at their windows, staring toward the Morant cabin, as though expecting it to burst into flames. Inside the house, Elise sat on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest, her hair hanging over her face. She had not spoken since the night of the priest's disappearance. She would not answer her mother's voice, nor her father's trembling questions. She simply stared ahead, as though looking through the walls, the woods, the swamp, and into something far older than Louisiana itself. Julianne hovered beside her daughter, brushing her hair away from her eyes every few minutes, whispering fragments of lullabies she had sung when Elise was small. None of them helped. None of them reached her. Mathieu sat in a chair near the door, holding a shotgun loosely in his hands, though deep in his heart he knew it wouldn't matter. Nothing they owned could stop whatever had taken root inside their child. The candles flickered, shrinking and stretching like they were being breathed upon. Each time the flames bent, Elise's fingers twitched. When the wind howled outside, her head tilted as though listening to something in the distance. When lightning cracked across the sky, her shoulders shivered. She was waiting. The whole cabin felt like it was waiting with her. Mathieu rose from his chair when he heard a faint tapping against the wall. It was not the sound of branches. It was softer, closer, like fingertips brushing wood. He tightened his grip on the shotgun, his breath catching deep in his chest. Rounding the corner toward the back room, he pressed his palm flat against the wall. The tapping stopped. Then it tapped back. 3 slow knocks from inside the wall. Mathieu stumbled away, heart pounding, but when he returned to the main room, Elise was standing. She hadn't stood in 3 days. Her bare feet made no sound on the floorboards. Her eyes were open fully for the first time since the priest vanished, but they were not the eyes of a child. They were darker, older, as though something vast stared through them. Julianne whispered her name, but the girl didn't react. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed toward the door. Not shakily, not like a frightened child, with certainty, with purpose, as if summoning someone. The knocking came again, once, twice, then a long dragging scrape right across the cabin's exterior. Mathieu shook his head. "No," he breathed, stepping between the child and the door. "We're not opening anything, not tonight." The lantern on the table blew out without warning, not flickered, not dimmed. It simply died, as though pinched between invisible fingers. The room fell into syrup-thick darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. In that red flicker, Elise turned slowly and stared at the front door. Her lips parted. A voice slipped out. Not her voice, not any human voice. It was deep, layered, made of echoes, and every syllable vibrated the floor beneath their feet. "Open." Julianne clapped her hands over her ears, shaking. Stop it, please." Mathieu raised the shotgun. "Don't you come any closer." But Elise didn't obey him. She didn't even acknowledge him. She began walking toward the door, each step slow, deliberate, mechanical, like she wasn't moving by her own will. Mathieu stood in front of her. "You're not opening that door," he said, voice cracking. She didn't stop. Even without touching him, even without lifting a hand, something pushed him aside. His body slammed into the table, knocking the lantern to the floor. The air felt thick, charged, electrified. His limbs refused to move. Julianne screamed as Elise reached the door and placed her small hand against it. The wood beneath her palm began to glow faintly, as though warmed from inside. Something was on the other side, breathing, waiting. Mathieu fought against whatever unseen force held him down. "Elise, don't!" The girl spoke again, her voice slipping through the room like cold water. "They have waited long enough." The lock slid open by itself. Julianne rushed forward, grabbing her daughter around the waist, pulling her back with all the strength in her shaking arms. But Elise didn't resist. She simply turned and looked at her mother with those hollow, ancient eyes. And for the first time in weeks, she spoke in her own voice. "Maman." Julianne froze. Yes, baby, I'm here. Let go." The way she said it was so gentle, so soft, so heartbreakingly calm that Julianne hesitated. In that hesitation, Elise reached up, touched her mother's cheek and whispered, "It's not you they want." Mathieu lunged, grabbing the girl before the door could swing open completely. He pulled her back, slamming his shoulder into the wood to keep it closed. The force on the other side pushed hard enough to splinter one of the hinges. He roared in fear, bracing himself. "Julianne, tie the rope, now." Julianne grabbed the rope from the fireplace tools and wrapped it around the door handle, tying it to the heavy iron stove. The stove groaned under some massive weight pushing from outside, metal grinding across the floor. The house shook, dust fell from the rafters, the door bulged inward. Then the wind vanished. Everything became unnervingly, impossibly silent. Mathieu held his breath and pressed his ear to the wood. Nothing. No breathing. No tapping. No voices. The pressure disappeared like someone stepping back from the door. He turned toward Elise, who stood in the center of the room, watching him with an expression too calm for a child. "It wasn't time," she said. Mathieu swallowed hard. "Time for what? For them?" She blinked slowly. "And for me?" Julianne stepped beside her husband, gripping his arm. "Baby, who are you talking about? Who's outside?" Elise turned toward the window. The storm had passed, leaving the woods drenched and silent. Mist curled between the trees like fingers. "They followed the priest," she whispered. Mathieu stiffened. "The priest? You saw him? You know where he went?" Elise didn't answer. She walked toward the fireplace, knelt beside the ashes, and drew her finger through the soot, leaving long black strokes on the floor. As they watched, the lines connected into a crude circle with 7 marks around it. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, staring at her own drawing. Julianne crouched beside her. "Sweetheart." "What is that?" "It's where they were," she murmured. "Before there were names, before there were people." Her small hand hovered above one of the marks. "He was the first to hear them." Mathieu whispered, "The priest." Elise nodded. "He listened too long." Julianne sobbed softly. "Baby, please, I don't understand." The girl reached out and touched her mother's trembling hand. "You don't need to understand." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to her mother's chest, the first affectionate gesture she had made in weeks. "You just need to forget." Julianne's breath hitched. "Forget what?" Elise closed her eyes and tears slipped down her cheeks. The sound of their voices, as the last candle sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness, Mathieu felt a cold wind blow across his face, coming not from outside the house but from somewhere behind Elise, as though something ancient had moved through the room and out again. When the dawn finally came, the door was still tied shut. The knocking never returned. No voices whispered through the walls. No apparition stood in the swamp mist watching the house. But Elise never spoke again, not in any language, not even her own. And though the priest was eventually found 3 weeks later, wandering aimlessly miles from Belmire, his mind shattered, his tongue burned black as charcoal, and his journal filled with desperate scribbles that were never deciphered, he repeated only one sentence, over and over until the day he died. She wasn't learning their language. She was teaching them ours. And in the years that followed, some nights the wind carried faint whispers through Belmire, as though something in the swamp still spoke in voices older than time. But never after midnight, never again. Because whatever followed Elise that night finally found what it was waiting for.